Good morning, pretty shiny peoples. One sec, I gotta answer this message. Okay. For those of you who missed the live last night, don't worry. You didn't miss anything, and we did not talk about anything important. Hey, Wild, it is always good to see you. One sec, I gotta answer this message. You did miss me, for laughing at myself so hard that I was crying. Night. Don't worry, that was about it. You didn't miss anything. Not like crying, you know, but we did not. I was laughing so hard. Important. Hey, Wild, it is always good to see you. One sec, I gotta answer this message. A little bit tipsy, and you did very amused at myself, I guess. Anyway. Laughing at myself so hard that I was crying. Don't worry, that was about it. Not like crying, you know, but we did not. I was laughing so hard. Important. Hey, Wild, it is always good to see you. One sec, I gotta answer this message. A little bit tipsy, and you did very amused at myself, I guess. Anyway, laughing at myself so hard that I was crying. Don't worry, that was about it. Yes, not like crying, you know, but we did not. I was laughing so hard. Important. Hey, Wild, it is always good to see you. And the last couple of readings, you did very amused at myself, I guess. Anyway. Laughing at myself so hard that I was crying. Don't worry, that was about it. Yes, not like crying, you know, but we did not. I was laughing so hard. Important. Hey, Wild, it is always good to see you. And the last couple of readings, you did very amused at myself, I guess. Anyway, laughing at myself so hard that I was crying. Don't worry, that was about it. Yes, not like crying, you know, but we did not. I was laughing so hard. Hey, Wild, it is always right around. And the last couple of readings, you did very amused at myself, I guess. Anyway, laughing at myself so hard that I was crying. It was good to have you. That was about it. Yes, not like crying, she had never in her life had such a strong. I was laughing so hard. Hey, Wild, it is always right around. And the last couple of readings, you did very amused at myself, I guess. Anyway, laughing at myself so hard that I was crying. It was good to have you. That was about it. Yes, not like crying, she had never in her life had such a strong. I was laughing so hard. This was amazing. And the last couple of readings, you did very amused at myself. Anyway, laughing at myself so hard that I was crying. It was good to have you. That was about it. Yes, not like crying, she had never in her life had such a strong. I was laughing so hard. This was amazing. And the last couple of readings, you did very amused laughing at myself so hard that I was crying. It was good to have you. That was about it. Not like crying, she had never in her life had such a strong. I was laughing so hard. This was amazing. And the last couple of readings, you did very amused. Too much. For what else? Laughing at myself so hard that I was crying. It was good to have you. That was about it. Not like crying, she had never in her life she had made her. I was laughing so hard. This was amazing. And the too much. For what else? Laughing at myself so hard that I was crying. It was good to have you. That was about it. Not like crying, she had never in her life she had made her. I was laughing so hard. This was amazing. And the too much. For what else? Laughing at myself so hard that I was crying. It was good to have you. That was about it. Not like crying, she had never in her life she had made her. I was laughing so hard. This was amazing. And too much. For what else? Laughing at myself so hard that I was crying. It was good to have you. That was about it. Not like crying, she had never in her life she had made her. I was laughing so hard. This was amazing. And too much. For what else? Laughing at myself so hard that I was crying. It was good to have you. That was about it. Not like crying, she had never in her life she had made her. I was laughing so hard. This was amazing. And Okay, did that fix the echo? Am I still echoing? Anybody? Okay, nobody's answering me. I don't know if I fixed the echo or not. I'll start over until somebody tells me I'm echoing, I guess. Alright. I don't know what I did. I clicked a bunch of things. So, here we go. She had never in her life had such a strange night, and it was probably not surprising that she didn't hear the rider approaching from behind until he was almost upon her. The thing that troubled her most as she made her way back toward town was her new understanding of the compact she had made. It was good to have a reprieve, months yet before she would have to live up to her end of the bargain, but a reprieve didn't change the basic fact. When the demon moon was full, she would lose her virginity to Mayor Thorin, a skinny, twitchy man with fluffy white hair rising like a cloud around the bald spot on top of his head. A man whose wife regarded him with a certain weary sadness that was painful to look at. Hart Thorin was a man who laughed uproariously when a company of players put on an entertainment involving head-knocking or pretend punching or rotten fruit throwing, but who only looked puzzled at a story which was pathetic or tragical. A knuckle-cracker, a backslapper, a dinner-table belcher, a man who had a way of looking anxiously towards his chancellor at almost every other word, as if to make sure he hadn't offended Reimer in some way. Susan had observed all these things often. Her father had for years been in charge of the barony's horse and had gone to seafront often on business. Many times he had taken his much-loved daughter with him. Oh, she had seen a lot of Hart Thorin over the years, and he had seen a lot of her as well. Too much, mayhap. For what now seemed the most important fact about him was that he was almost 50 years older than the girl who would perhaps bear his son. She had made the bargain lightly enough. No, not lightly. That was being unfair to herself. But she had lost little sleep over it, that much was true. She had thought, after listening to all Aunt Cord's arguments, well, it's little enough, really, to have the indenture off the lands, to finally own your own little piece of the drop, in fact as well as in tradition. To actually have papers, one in our house and one in the Reimer's files, saying it's ours. Aye, and to have horses again, only 3, 'tis true, but that's 3 more than we have now. And against that, to lie with a man a time or two and to bear a child, which millions of women have done before me with no harm. 'Tis not, after all, a mutant or a leper I'm being asked to partner with, but just an old man with noisy knuckles. 'Tis not forever, and, as Aunt Cord says, I may still marry if time and Caw decree. I should not be the first woman to come to her husband's bed as a mother, and does it make me a whore to do such? The law says not, but never mind that. My heart's law is what matters, and my heart says that if I may gain the land that my da's and 3 horses to run on it by, being such, then a whore is what I'll be. There was something else. Aunt Cord had capitalized, rather ruthlessly, Susan now saw, on child's innocence. It was the baby Aunt Cord had harped on. The cunning little baby she would have. Aunt Cord had known that Susan, the dolls of her childhood put aside not all that long ago, would love the idea of her own baby, a little living doll to dress and feed and sleep with in the heat of the afternoon. What Cordelia had ignored, perhaps she's too innocent even to have considered it, Susan thought, but didn't quite believe, was that the hag woman had made brutally clear to her this evening Thorin wanted more than a child. He wants tits and arse that don't squish in his hands and a box that'll grip what he pushes. Just thinking of those words made her face throb as she walked through the post-moonset dark toward town. No high-spirited running this time, no singing either. She had agreed with vague thoughts of how managed livestock mated. They were allowed to go at it until the seed took, then separated again. But now she knew that Thorin might want her again and again, probably would want her again and again, and common law going back like iron for 200 generations said that he could continue to lie with her until she, who had proved the consort honest, should prove her honesty with child as well, and that child honest in and of itself, not that was a mutant aberration. Susan had made discreet inquiries and knew that this second proving usually came around the 4th month of pregnancy. Around the time she would begin to show, even with her clothes on, it would be up to Rhea to make that judgment, and Rhea didn't like her. Now that it was too late, now that she had accepted the compact formally tendered by the Chancellor, now that she had been proved honest by yon strange bitch, she rued the bargain. Mostly what she thought of was how Thorin would look with his pants off, his legs white and skinny like the legs of a stork, and how as they lay together she would hear his long bones crackling, knees and back and elbows and neck and knuckles. Don't forget his knuckles. Yes, big old man's knuckles with hair growing out of them. Susan chuckled at the thought. It was that comical, but at the same time a warm tear ran unnoticed from the corner of one eye and tracked down her cheek. She wiped it away without knowing it, any more than she had heard the clip-clip of the approaching hooves in the soft road dust. Her mind was still far away, returning to the odd thing she had seen through the old woman's bedroom window. The soft but somehow unpleasant light coming from the pink globe, the hypnotized way the hag had been looking down at it. When Susan at last heard the approaching horse, her first alarmed thought was that she must get into the crop of trees she was currently passing and hide. The chances of anyone above board being on the road this late seemed so small to her, especially now that such bad times had come to Midworld, but it was too late for that. The ditch then, and sprawled flat with the moon down, there was at least a chance that whoever it was would pass without. But before she could even begin in that direction, the rider who had sneaked up behind her while she was thinking her long and rueful thoughts had hailed her. "Good evening, lady, and may your days be long upon this earth." She turned, thinking, what if it's one of the new men always lounging about the mayor's house, or in the Traveler's Rest? Not the oldest one. The voice isn't wavery like his, but maybe one of the others. It could be the one they called DePape. "Good even," she heard herself saying to the man-shape on the tall horse. "May yours be long also." Her voice didn't tremble, not that she could hear. She didn't think it was DePape or the one named Reynolds either. The only thing she could tell about the fellow for sure was that he wore a flat-brimmed hat, the sort she associated with men of the inner baronies, back when travel between east and west had been more common than it was now, back before John Farson came, the good man, and the bloodletting began. As for the stranger came up beside her, she forgave herself a little for not hearing him approach. There was no buckle or bell on his gear that she could see, and everything was tied down so as not to snap or flap. It was almost the rig of an outlaw or a harrier. She had the idea that Jonas, he of the wavery voice, and his two friends might have been both, in other times and other climes, or even a gunslinger. But this man bore no guns, unless they were hidden, a bow on the pommel of his saddle, and what looked like a lance in the scabbard, that was all. And there had never, she reckoned, been a gunslinger as young as this. He clucked, side-mouthed at the horse, just as her dad always done, and she herself, of course, and it stopped at once. As she swung one leg over his saddle, lifting it high with unconscious grace, Susan said, "Nay, nay, don't trouble yourself, stranger, but go as you would." If he heard the alarm in her voice, he paid no heed to it. He slipped off the horse, not bothering to tie down the stirrup, and landed neatly in front of her, the dust of the road puffing about his square-toed boots. By starlight, she saw that he was young indeed, close to her own age, on one side or the other. His clothes were those of a working cowboy, although new. "Will Dearborn, at your service," he said, then doffed his hat, extended a foot on one boot heel, and bowed as they did in the inner baronies. Such absurd courtliness out here in the middle of nowhere, with the acrid smell of the oil patch on the edge of town already in her nostrils, startled her out of her fear and into a laugh. She thought it would likely offend him, but he smiled instead. A good smile, honest and artless, its inner part lined with even teeth. She dropped him a little curtsy, holding out one side of her dress. "Susan Delgado, at yours." He tapped his throat thrice with his right hand. "Thanky, Cy, Susan Delgado. We're well met, I hope. I didn't mean to startle you." "You did, a little. Yes, I thought I had. I'm sorry." "Yes, not I, but yes. A young man from the inner baronies by the sound." She looked at him with new interest. "Nay, ye need not apologize, for I was deep in my own thoughts," she said. "I'd been to see a friend, and hadn't realized how much time had passed till I saw the moon was down. If ye stopped out of concern, I thank ye, stranger, but ye may be on your way, as I would be on mine. It's only to the edge of the village I go. Hambury. It's close now." "Pretty speech and lovely sentiments," he answered with a grin. "But it's late, you're alone, and I think we may as well pass on together. Do you ride, Cy?" "Yes, but really, step over and meet my friend Rusher, then. He shall carry you the last 2 miles. He's gelded, Cy, and gentle." She looked at Will Dearborn with a mixture of amusement and irritation. The thought which crossed her mind was, if he calls me Cy again, as though I were a school teacher or his dottery old great-aunt, I'm going to take off this stupid apron and swat him with it. I never minded a bit of temper in a horse docile enough to wear a saddle. Until his death, my father managed the mayor's horses, and the mayor in these parts is also guard of barony. I've ridden my whole life." She thought he might apologize, perhaps even stutter, but he only nodded with a calm thoughtfulness that she rather liked. "Then step to the stirrup, my lady. I'll walk beside and trouble you with no conversation if you'd rather not have it. It's late, and talk pals after moonset, some say. She shook her head, softening her refusal with a smile. "Nay, I thank ye for your kindness, but it would not be well. Mayhap for me to be seen riding a strange young man's horse at 11 o'clock. Lemon juice won't take the stain out of a young lady's reputation the way it will out of a shirtwaist, you know?" "There's no one out here to see you," the young man said, in a maddeningly reasonable voice. "And that you're tired, I can tell. Come, Cy, please don't call me that. It makes me feel as ancient as a—" She hesitated for a brief moment, rethinking the word, which, that first came to her mind. "Is an old woman—" "Miss Delgado, then. Are you sure you won't ride?" "Sure as can be. I'd not ride cross-saddle in a dress in any case, Mr. Dearborn. Not even if you were my own brother. 'Twouldn't be proper." He stood in the stirrup himself, reached over to the far side of his saddle. Rusher stood docilely enough, only flicking his ears, which Susan would have been happy to flick herself, had she been Rusher. They were beautiful, and stepped back down with a rolled garment in his hands. It was tied with a rawhide hank. She thought it was a poncho. "You may spread this over your lap and legs like a duster," he said. "There's quite enough of it for decorum's sake. It was my father's, and he's taller than me." He looked off toward the western hills for a moment, and when she saw he was handsome in a hard sort of way that jagged against his youth, she felt a little shiver inside of her, and wished for the 1,000th time that the foul old woman had kept her hands strictly on her business. As unpleasant as that business had been, Susan didn't want to look at this handsome stranger and remember Rhea's touch. "Nay," she said gently. "Thank ye again. I recognize your kindness, but I must refuse." "Then I'll walk along beside, and Rusher'll be our chaperone," he said cheerfully. "As far as the edge of town, at least. There'll be no eyes to see and think ill of a perfectly proper young woman and a more or less proper young man. And once again I'll tip my hat and wish you a very good night." "I wish you wouldn't, really." She brushed a hand across her forehead. "Easy for you to say, there are no eyes to see, but sometimes there are eyes even where there shouldn't be, and my position is a little delicate just now." "I'll walk with you, however," he repeated, and now his face was somber. "These are not good times, Miss Delgado. Here in Mejis you are far from the worst of the troubles, but sometimes trouble reaches out." She opened her mouth to protest again. She supposed perhaps to tell him that Pat Delgado's daughter could take care of herself, and then she thought of the mayor's new men and the cold way they had run their eyes over her when Thorin's attention had been elsewhere. She had seen those three this very night, and she left on her way to the witch's hut. Them she had heard approaching, and in plenty of time for her to leave the road and rest behind a handy pinon tree. She refused to think of it as hiding exactly. Back toward the town they had gone, and she supposed they were drinking at the Traveler's Rest right now, and would continue until Stanley Ruiz closed the bar. But she had no way of knowing that for sure. They could come back. "If I can't dissuade ye, very well," she said, sighing with a vexed resignation she didn't really feel. "But only to the first mailbox, Mrs. Beach's. That marks the edge of town." He tapped his throat again and made another of those absurd, enchanting bows, foot stuck out as if he would trip someone, heel planted in the dirt. "Thank ye, Miss Delgado." At least he didn't call me Cy, she thought. That's a start. She thought he'd chatter away like a magpie in spite of his promise to be silent, because that was what boys did around her. She was not vain of her looks, but she thought she was good-looking, if only because the boys could not shut up or stop shuffling their feet when they were around her. And this one would be full of questions the town boys didn't need to ask. How old was she? Had she always lived in Hambury? Were her parents alive? Half a hundred others just as boring, but they would all circle in on the same one. Did she have a steady fellow? But Will Dearborn of the Inner Baronies didn't ask her about her schooling or family or friends, the most common way of approaching any romantic rivals, she had found. Will Dearborn simply walked along beside her, one hand wrapped around Rusher's bridle, looking off east toward the clean sea. They were close enough to it now that the teary smell of salt mingled with the tarry stench of oil, even though the wind was from the south. They were passing Sitco now, and she was glad for Will Dearborn's presence, even if his silence was a little irritating. She had always found the oil patch with its skeletal forest of gantries a little spooky. Most of those steel towers had stopped pumping long since, and there was neither the parts, the need, nor the understanding to repair them. And those which did still labor along, 19 out of about 200, could not be stopped. They just pumped and pumped, the supplies of oil beneath them seemingly inexhaustible. And little was used, but very little. Most simply ran back down into the wells beneath the dead pumping stations. The world had moved on, and this place reminded her of a strange mechanical graveyard where some of the corpses hadn't quit. Something cold and smooth nuzzled the small of her back, and she wasn't quite able to stifle a little shriek. Will Dearborn wheeled toward her, his hand dropping toward his belt. Then he relaxed and smiled. Rusher's way of saying he feels ignored. "I'm sorry, Miss Delgado." She looked at the horse. Rusher looked back mildly, then dipped his head as if to say he was also sorry for having startled her. "Foolishness, girl," she thought, hearing the hearty, no-nonsense voice of her father. "He wants to know why you're being so standoffy, that's all. And so do I. 'Tisn't like you, so it's not." "Mr. Dearborn, I've changed my mind," she said. "I'd like to ride." He turned his back and stood looking out at Sitco and his hands in his pocket while Susan first laid the poncho over the cantle of the saddle, the plain black saddle of a working cowboy without a barony brand or even a ranch brand to mark it. And then she mounted into the stirrup. She lifted her skirt and glanced around sharply, not sure he would be stealing a peek, but his back was still to her. He seemed fascinated with the rusty old oil derricks. "What's so interesting about them, Cully?" she thought, a trifle crossly. It was the lateness of the hour and the residue of her stirred-up emotions, she supposed. Filthy old things have been there 6 centuries more, and I've been smelling their stink my whole life. "Stand easy now, my boy," she said once she had her foot fixed in the stirrup. One hand held the top of the saddle's pommel, and the other the reins. Rusher meanwhile flicked his ears as if to say he would stand easy all night, were that which he required. Side note here, if you like horses, don't do that. Don't do that when you mount a horse. if you're going to go horseback riding, don't grab the pommel of the saddle to pull yourself up. You're actually causing damage to the horse and to the horse's back. You should grab their mane. You should grab their mane and pull their mane to pull yourself up. That sounds like it's painful. It's not. They actually don't have nerve endings there, and it's actually like a really, really strong muscle for them. And yeah, don't grab the pommel of the saddle. Sorry, weird rant there. But anyway, where were we? She swung up, one long bare thigh flashing in the starlight, and felt the exhilaration of being horsed that she always felt. Only tonight it seemed a little stronger, a little sweeter, and a little sharper. Perhaps because the horse was such a beauty. Perhaps because the horse was a stranger. Perhaps because the horse's owner is a stranger, she thought, and fair. That was nonsense, of course, and potentially dangerous nonsense, yet it was true. He was fair. As she opened the poncho and spread it over her legs, Dearborn began to whistle, and she realized with a mixture of surprise and superstitious fear what the tune was. Careless Love. The very lay she had been singing on her way up to Rhea's hut. Mayhap it's Caw, girl, her father's voice whispered. No such thing, she thought right back at him. I'll not see Caw in every passing wind and shadow like the old ladies who gather in the green heart of a summer's evening. It's an old tune. Everyone knows it. Not Caw. She would not be seduced by the dark and the shadows and the grim shapes of the oil derricks into believing it was. Not Caw, but only a chance meeting with a nice young man on the lonely road back to town. I've made myself decent, she said in a dry voice that didn't sound much like her own. You may turn back if you like, Mr. Dearborn. He did turn and gazed at her. For a moment he said nothing, but she could see the look in his eyes well enough to know that he found her fair as well. And although this disquieted her, perhaps because of what he'd been whistling, she was also glad. Then he said, You look well up there. You sit well. And I shall have horses of my own to sit before long, she said. Now the questions will come, she thought. But he only nodded, as though he had known this about her already, and began to walk toward town again. Feeling a little disappointed and not knowing exactly why, she clucked side-mouth at Rusher and twitched her knees at him. He got moving, catching up with his master, who gave Rusher's muzzle a companionable little caress. What do they call that place yonder? He asked, pointing at the derricks. The oil patch. The oil patch? Sitco. Some of the derricks still pump? Aye, and no way to stop them, not that anyone still knows. Oh, he said, and that was all, just, oh. But he left his place by Rusher's head for a moment, and when they came to the weedy track leading into Sitco, walking across to look at the old, disused guard hut. In her childhood, there had been a sign on it reading, Authorized personnel only, but it had blown away in some windstorm or another. Will Dearborn had his look and then came ambling back toward the horse, boots puffing up summer dust, easy in his new clothes. They went toward town. A young walking man in a flat-crowned hat, a young riding woman with a poncho spread over her lap and legs. The starlight rained down on them, as it has on young men and women since the time's first hour, and once she looked up and saw a meteor flash overhead, a brief and brilliant orange streak across the vault of the heaven. Susan thought to wish on it, and then, with something like panic, realized she had no idea what to wish for. None at all. She kept her own silence until they were a mile from town, and then asked the question which had been on her mind. She had planned to ask hers after he had begun asking his, and it irked her to be the one to break the silence, but in the end, her curiosity was too much. Where do you come from, Mr. Dearborn, and what brings you to our little bit of Midworld, if you don't mind me asking? Not at all, he said, looking up at her with a smile. I'm glad to talk, and was only trying to think how to begin. Talk's not a specialty of mine. Then what is, Will Dearborn? She wondered. Yes, she wondered very much, for in adjusting her position on the saddle, she had put her hand on the rolled blanket behind and had touched something hidden inside that blanket. Something that felt like a gun. It didn't have to be, of course, but she remembered the way his hands had dropped instinctively toward his belt when she had cried out in surprise. I come from the in-world. I've an idea you probably guessed that much on your own. We have our own way of talking. Aye. Which barony is your home, might I ask? New Canaan. She felt a flash of real excitement at that. New Canaan? Center of the affiliation. That did not mean all it once had, of course, but still. Not Gilead? She asked, detesting the hint of a girlish gush she heard in her voice, and more than just a hint, perhaps. No, he said with a laugh. Nothing so grand as Gilead. Only Hemp Hill, a village 40 or so wheels west of there. Smaller than Hambry, I wot. Wheels, she thought, marveling at the archaism. He said wheels. And what brings ye to Hambry, then? May ye tell? Why not? I've come with two of my friends, Mr. Richard Stockworth of Pendleton, New Canaan, and Mr. Arthur Heath, a hilarious young man who actually does come from Gilead. We're here at the order of the affiliation, and have come as counters. Counters of what? Counters of anything and everything which may aid the affiliation in the coming years, he said, and she heard no lightness in his voice now. The business with the good man has grown serious. Has it? We hear little real news this far to the south and east of the hub. He nodded. The barony's distance from the hub is the chief reason we're here. Mahis has been ever loyal to the affiliation, and if supplies need to be drawn from this part of the outers, they'll be sent. The question that needs answering is how much the affiliation can count on. How much of what? Yes, he agreed, as if she'd made a statement instead of asking a question. And how much of what? You speak as though the good man really were a threat. He's just a bandit, surely, frosting his thefts and murders with talk of democracy and equality. Dearborn shrugged. And she thought for a moment that would be his only comment on the matter. But then he said reluctantly, "'Twas once so, perhaps. Times have changed. At some point the bandit became a general, and now the general would become a ruler in the name of the people." He paused, then added gravely, "The northern and western baronies are in flames, lady." "But those are thousands of miles away, surely." This talk was upsetting and yet strangely exciting, too. Mostly it seemed exotic, after the pokey, all-days-the-same world of Hambry, where someone's dry well was good for 3 days of animated conversation. "Yes," he said. "Not I, but yes." The sound was both strange and pleasing to her ear, but the wind is blowing in this direction. He turned to her and smiled. Once more it softened his hard, good looks, and made him seem no more than a child, up too late after his bedtime. "But I don't think we'll see John Farson tonight, do you?" She smiled back. "If we did, Mr. Dearborn, you would protect me from him." "No doubt," he said, still smiling. "But I should do so with greater enthusiasm, I want, if you were to let me call you by the name your father gave you. Then, in the interest of my own safety, ye may do so, and I suppose I must call ye Will in those same interests." "'Tis both wise and prettily put," he said, the smile becoming a grin, wide and engaging. Then walking as he was, with his face turned back and up to her, Susan's new friend tripped over a rock jutting out of the road and almost fell. Rusher whinnied through his nose and reared a little. Susan laughed merrily. The poncho shifted, revealing one bare leg, and she took a moment before putting matters right again. She liked him, aye, so she did. And what harm could there be in it? He was only a boy, after all. When he smiled, she could see he was only a year or two removed from jumping in the haystacks. The thought that she had recently graduated from the haystack jumping herself had somehow fled her mind. "I'm usually not clumsy," he said. "I hope I didn't startle you." "Not at all, Will. Boys have been stubbing their toes around me ever since I grew my breasts." "Not at all," she said, and returned to the previous topic. It interested her greatly. "So ye and your friends come out behest of the affiliation to count our goods, do you?" "Yes. The reason I took particular note of yon oil patch is because one of us will have to come back and count the working derricks. I can spare you that, Will. There are 19. He nodded. "I'm in your debt. But we'll also need to make out, if we can, how much oil those 19 pumps are bringing up. Are there so many oil-fired machines still working in New Canaan that such news matters? And do ye have alchemy to change the oil into the stuff your machines can use? It's called refinery rather than alchemy in this case. At least, I think so. And I believe there's one that still works. But no, we haven't that many machines. Although there are still a few working filament lights in the great halls of Gilead. Fancy it, she said, delighted. She had seen pictures of filament lights and electric flambeaux but never the lights themselves. The last ones in Hanbury, they had been called spark lights in this part of the world, but she felt sure they were the same, had burned out 2 generations ago. You said your father managed the mayor's horses until his death, Will Dearborn said. Was his name Patrick Delgado? It was, wasn't it? She looked down at him, badly startled and brought back to reality in an instant. How do you know that? His name was in our lessons of calling. We're to count we're to count cattle, sheep, pigs, oxen, and horses. Of all your livestock, horses are the most important. Patrick Delgado was the man we were to see in that regard. I'm sorry to hear he has come to the clearing at the end of the path, Susan. Will you accept my condolences? Aye, and with thanks. Was it an accident? Aye. Hoping her voice said what she wanted to say, which was, leave this subject and ask no more. Let me be honest with you, he said. And for the first time, she thought she heard a false note there. Perhaps it was only her imagination. Certainly she had little experience of the world. Aunt Cord reminded her of this almost daily. But she had an idea that people who set on by saying, let me be honest with you, were apt to go on by telling you straight-faced that rain fell up, money grew on trees, and babies were brought by the Grand Federal. I will, Dearborn, she said, her tone just the tiniest bit dry. They say honesty's the best policy, so they do. He looked at her, a bit doubtfully, and then his smile shone out again. That smile was dangerous, she thought, a quicksand smile, if ever there was one. Easy to wander in, perhaps more difficult to wander back out. There's not much affiliation in the affiliation these days. That's part of the reason Farson's gone on as long as he has. That's what has allowed his ambitions to grow. He's come a far way from the harrier who began as a stage robber in the Gallon and Desoy, and he'll come farther yet if the affiliation isn't revitalized, maybe all the way to Mahees. She couldn't imagine what the good man could possibly want with her own sleepy little town in the barony which lay closest to the clean sea, but she kept silent. In any case, it wasn't really the affiliation that sent us, he said. Not all this way to count cows and oil derricks and hectares of land under cultivation. He paused a moment, looking down at the road, as if for more rocks in the way of his boots, and stroking Rusher's nose with absent-minded gentleness. She thought he was embarrassed, perhaps, even shamed. We were sent by our fathers. Then she understood. Bad boys they were, sent out on a make-work quest that wasn't quite exile. She guessed their real job in the Hanbury might be to rehabilitate their reputations. Well, she thought, it certainly explains the quicksand smile, doesn't it? Wear this one, Susan. He's the sort to burn bridges and upset mail carts, then go on his merry way without a single look back. Not in meanness, but in plain old boy carelessness. That made her think of the old song again, the one she had been singing, the one he'd been whistling. Our fathers, yes. Susan Delgado had cut a caper or two, or perhaps it was 24, of her own inner time, and she felt sympathy for Will Dearborn, as well as caution and interest. Bad boys could be amusing, up to a point. The question was, how bad had Will and his cronies been? Helling? She asked. Helling, he agreed, still sounding glum, but perhaps brightening just a bit about the eyes and mouth. We were warned, yes, warned very well. There was a certain amount of drinking, and a few girls to squeeze with the hand, not busy squeezing the ale pot. It was a question no nice girl could outright ask, but one that couldn't help occurring to her mind. Now the smile, which had played briefly around the corners of his mouth, dropped away. We pushed it too far and the fun stopped. Fools have a way of doing that. One night there was a race. One moonless night. After midnight, all of us drunk. One of the horses caught his hoof in a gopher hole and snapped a foreleg. He had to be put down. Susan winced. It wasn't the worst thing she could think of, but bad enough, and when he opened his mouth again, it got worse. The horse was a thoroughbred. One of just 3 owned by my friend Richard's father, who was not well-to-do. There were scenes in our households which I haven't any desire to remember, let alone talk about. I'll make a long story short and say that, after much talk and many proposals for punishment, we were sent here on this errand. It was Arthur's father's idea. I think Arthur's dad has always been a bit appalled by Arthur. Certainly Arthur's ructions didn't come from George Heath's side. Susan smiled to herself, thinking of Aunt Cordelia saying, "She certainly doesn't get it from our side of the family." Then the calculated pause, followed by, "She had a great aunt on her mother's side who ran crazy. You didn't know?" "Yes, set herself on fire and threw herself over the drop. In the year of the comet, it was." "Anyway," Will resumed, "Mr. Heath set us on our way, saying from his own father, one should meditate in purgatory, and here we are. Hanbury's far from purgatory." He stretched his funny little brow again. If it were, all should want to be bad enough to come here and meet the pretty denizens." "Work on that one a bit," she said in her driest voice. "It's still rough, I fear. Perhaps—" She fell silent as a dismaying realization occurred to her. She was going to have to hope this boy would enter into a limited conspiracy with her. Otherwise, she was apt to be embarrassed. "Susan? I was just thinking. Are you here yet, Will? Officially, I mean?" "No," he said, taking her meaning at once, and likely already seeing where this was going. He seemed sharp enough in his way. "We only arrived in Barony this afternoon, and you're the first person any of us has spoken to. Unless, that is, Richard and Arthur have met folks. I couldn't sleep, and so came out to ride and to think things over a little. We're camped over there." He pointed to the right on the long slope that runs toward the sea. "Aye, the drop it's called." She realized that Will and his mates might even be camped on what would be her own land by law before much more time had passed. The thought was amusing and exciting and a little startling. "Tomorrow we ride into town and present our compliments to my Lord Mayor, Hart Thorin. He's a bit of a fool, according to what we were told before leaving New Canaan." "Were you indeed told so?" she asked, raising one eyebrow. "Yes, apt to blabber, fond of strong drink, and even more fond of young girls," Will said. "Is it true, would you say?" "I think you must judge for yourself," said she, stifling a smile with some effort. "In any case, we'll all be presenting to the Honorable Kemba Reimer, Thorin's chancellor, and I understand he knows his beans and counts his beans as well." "Thorin will have you to dinner at the mayor's house," Susan said. "Perhaps not tomorrow night, but surely the night after. A dinner of state in Hanbury," Will said, smiling and still stroking Rusher's nose. "Gods, how I'll bear the agony of my anticipation." "Never mind your nettlesome mouth," she said, "but only listen. If you be my friend, this is important." His smile dropped away, and she saw again, as she had for a moment or two before, the man he'd be before too many years had passed. The hard face, the concentrated eyes, the merciless mouth. It was a frightening face in a way, a frightening prospect. And yet still the place the old hag had touched felt warm, and she found it difficult to take her eyes off of him. What she wondered was his hair like that, What, she wondered, was his hair like under that stupid hat he wore? "Tell me, Susan. If you and your friends come to the table at Thorin's, ye may see me. If you see me, Will, see me for the first time. See Miss Delgado as I shall see Mr. Dearborn. Do ye take my meaning?" "To the letter." He was looking at her thoughtfully. "Do you serve? Surely if your father was Barony's chief drover, you do not." "Never mind what I do or don't do. Just promise that if we meet at the seafront, we meet for the first time." "I promise, but no more questions. We've nearly come to the place where we must part ways, and I want to give you a warning. Fair payment for the ride on this nice mount of yours, mayhap. If you dine with Thorn and Reimer, you'll not be the only new folk at his table. There'll likely be 3 others, men Thorin has hired to serve as private guards of the house. Not as sheriff's deputies. Nay, they answer to none but Thorin, or mayhap to Reimer. Their names are Jonas, DePape, and Reynolds. They look like hard boys to me, although Jonas's boyhood is so long behind him that I imagine he's forgotten he ever had one. Jonas is the leader? Aye, he limps. Has hair that falls to his shoulders pretty much as any girl's, and the quavery voice of an old gaffer who spends his days polishing the chimney corner. But I think he's the most dangerous of the 3 all the same. I guess these 3 have forgot more about Helling than you and your friends will ever learn. Now why had she told him all that? She didn't know, exactly. Gratitude, perhaps? He had promised to keep the secret of this late-night meeting, and he had the look of a promise-keeper. And hack with his father's, or not. I'll watch them, and I thank you for the advice. They were now climbing a long, gentle slope. Overhead, Old Mother blazed relentlessly. Bodyguards, he mused. Bodyguards and sleepy little Hambry. It's strange times, Susan. Strange indeed. Aye. She had wondered about Jonas, DePape, and Reynolds herself, and could think of no good reason for them to be in town. Had they been Reimer's doing? Reimer's decision? It seemed likely. Thorin wasn't the sort of man to even think about bodyguards, she would have said. The High Sheriff had always done well enough for him, but still. Why? They breasted the hill. Below them lay a nestle of buildings, the village of Hambry. Only a few lights still shone. The brightest cluster marked the traveler's rest. From here, on the warm breeze, she could hear the piano beating out "Hey Jude," and a score of drunken voices gleefully murdering the chorus. Not the 3 men of whom she had warned Will Dearborn, though. They would be standing at the bar watching the room with their flat eyes. Not the singing type were those 3. Each had a small blue coffin-shaped tattoo on his right hand, burned into the webbing between thumb and forefinger. She thought to tell Will this, then realized he'd see for himself soon enough. Instead, she pointed a little way down the slope at the dark shape which overhung the road on a chain. Do you see that? Yes. He heaved a large and rather comical sigh. Is it the object I fear beyond all others? Is it the dread shape of Mrs. Beech's mailbox? Aye, and it's there we must part. If you say we must, we must. Yet I wish... Just then the wind shifted, as it sometimes did in the summer, and blew a strong gust out of the west. The smell of sea salt was gone in an instant, and so was the sound of the drunken singing voices. What replaced them was a sound infinitely more sinister, one that never failed to produce a scutter of goose-flesh up her back. A low, atonal noise, like the warble of a siren being turned by a man without much longer to live. Will took a step backwards, eyes widening, and again she noticed his hand take a dip toward his belt, as if reaching for something not there. What in God's name is that? It's the Thinny, she said quietly, in Eyebolt Canyon. Have you never heard of such? Heard of, yes, but never heard until now. Gods, how do you stand it? It sounds alive. She had never thought of it quite like that, but now, in a way, listening with her ears and with his ears instead of her own, she thought he was right. It was as if some sick part of the night had gained a voice and was actually trying to sing. She shivered. Rusher felt the momentary increased pressure of her knees and whickered softly, craning his head around to look at her. We don't often hear it so clearly at this time of year, she said. In the fall, the men burn it to quiet. I don't understand. Who did? Who understood anything anymore? Gods, they couldn't even turn off the few oil pumps in Citgo that still worked, although half of them squealed like pigs in a slaughtering chute. These days, you were usually just grateful to find things that still worked at all. In the summer, when there's time, drovers and cowboys drag loads of brush to the mouth of the Eyebolt, she said. Dead brush is all right, but live is better, for it's smoke that's wanted, and the heavier the better. Eyebolt's a box canyon, very short and steep-walled, almost like a chimney lying on its side, you see? Yes. The traditional time for burning is Reap Morn, the day after the fair and the feast and the fire, the first day of winter. Aye, though in these parts it doesn't feel like fire so soon, or like winter so soon. In any case, it's no tradition. The brush is sometimes lit sooner if the winds have been prankish or if the sound particularly strong. It upsets the livestock, you know. Cows give poorly when the noise of the thinny's strong, and it makes sleep difficult. I should think it would. Will was still looking north, and a stronger gust of wind blew his hat off. It fell to his back. The rawhide tug string pulling against the line of his throat, the hair so revealed was a little long, and as black as a crow's wing. She felt a sudden greedy desire to run her fingers through it, to let her fingers tell its texture, rough or smooth or silky. And how would it smell? At this she felt another shiver of heat down low in her belly. He turned to her as though he had read her mind, and she flushed, grateful that he wouldn't be able to see the darkening of her cheek. How long has it been there? Since before I was born, she said, but not before my dad was born. He said the ground shook in an earthquake just before it came. Some say the earthquake brought it. Some say that's superstitious nonsense. All I know is that it's always been there. The smoke quiets it a while, the way it will quiet a hive of bees or wasps, but the sound always comes back. The brush piled at the mouth helps to keep any wandering livestock out, too. Sometimes they're drawn to it. Gods know why, but if a cow or sheep does happen to get in, after the burning and before the next year's pile has started to grow, mayhap, it doesn't come back out. Whatever it is, it's hungry. She put his poncho aside, lifted her right leg over the saddle without so much as touching the horn, and slipped off Rusher. All this in a single liquid movement. It was a stunt made for pants rather than a dress, and she knew from the further widening of his eyes that he'd seen a good lot of her, but nothing she had to wash with the bathroom door closed, so what of that? And that quick dismount had ever been a favorite trick of hers when she was in a show-offy mood. Pretty, he exclaimed. I learned it from my da, she said, responding to the more innocent interpretation of his compliment. Her smile as she landed him the reins, however, suggested that she was willing to accept the compliment any way it was meant. Susan, have you ever seen the Thinny? Aye, once or twice from above. What does it look like? Ugly, she responded at once. Until tonight, when she had observed Rhea's smile up close and endured her twiddling, meddling fingers, she would have said it was the ugliest thing she had ever seen. It looks a little like a slow-burning peat fire, and a little like a swamp full of scummy green water. There's a mist that rises off of it. Sometimes it looks like long, skinny arms with hands at the end of them. Is it growing? Aye, they say it is, that the Thinny grows, but it grows slowly. It won't escape the Eyebolt Canyon in your time or mine. Then she looked up at the sky and saw the constellations had continued to tilt along their tracks as they spoke. She felt she could talk to him all night, about the Thinny or Sitgo or her irritating aunt or just about anything, and the idea dismayed her. Why should this happen to her now, for the God's sake, after 3 years of dismissing the Hambry boys? Why should she now meet a boy who interested her so strangely? Why was her life so unfair? Her earlier thought, the one she'd heard in her father's voice, reoccurred to her. If it's Ka, it'll come like a wind, and your plans will stand before it no more than a barn before a cyclone. But no, and no, and no, so set she with all her considerable determination, her mind against the idea. This was no barn. This was her life. Susan reached out and touched the rusty tin of Mrs. Beech's mailbox, as if to steady herself in the world. Her little hopes and daydreams didn't mean so much, perhaps, but her father had taught her to measure herself by her ability to do the things she'd said she would do, and she would not overthrow his teachings simply because she happened to encounter a good-looking boy at a time when her body and her emotions were in a stew. I'll leave you here to either rejoin your friends or resume your ride, she said. The gravity she heard in her voice made her feel a bit sad, for it was an adult gravity. But remember your promise, Will. If you see me at Seaford, at Seafront, Mayor's house, and if you'd be my friend, see me there for the first time as I'd see you." He nodded, and she saw her seriousness now mirrored in his own face, and the sadness, mayhap. "I've never asked a girl to ride out with me, or if she'd accept a visit of me. I'd ask of you, Susan, daughter of Patrick. I'd even bring you flowers to sweeten my chances, but it would do no good, I think." And she shook her head. "Nay, 'twouldn't. Are you promised in marriage? It's forward of me to ask, I know, but I mean no harm." "I'm sure you don't, but I'd soon as not answer. My position is a delicate one just now, as I told ye. Besides, it's late. Here's where we part, Will. But stay, one more moment." She rummaged in the pocket of her apron and brought out half a cake wrapped in a piece of green leaf. The other half she had eaten on the way up to the coast. In what now felt like another half of her life, she held what was left of her little evening meal out to Rusher, who sniffed it and then ate it and nuzzled her hand. She smiled, liking the velvet tickle in the cup of her palm. "Aye, thee's a good horse, so ye are." She looked at Will Dearborn, who stood in the road, shuffling his dusty boots and gazing at her unhappily. The hard look was gone from his face now. He looked her age again, or younger. "We were well met, weren't we?" he asked. She stepped forward, and before she could let herself think about what she was doing, she put her hands on his shoulders and stood on her toes and kissed him on the mouth. The kiss was brief, but not sisterly. "Aye, very well met, Will." But when he moved toward her, as thoughtlessly as a flower turning its face to follow the sun, wishing to repeat the experience, she pushed him back a step, gently but firmly. "Nay, that was only a thank you, and one thank you should be enough for a gentleman. Go your course in peace, Will." He looked up at the reins like a man in a dream, looked at them for a moment as if he didn't know what in the world they were, and then looked back at her. She could see him working to clear his mind and emotions of the impact of her kiss had made. She liked him for it, and she was very glad she had done it. "And you yours," he said, swinging into the saddle. "I look forward to meeting you for the first time." He smiled at her, and she saw both longing and wishes in that smile. Then he gigged the horse, turned him, and started back the way they'd come. To have another look at the oil patch, mayhap. She stood where she was, by Mrs. Beach's mailbox, willing him to turn around and wave so she could see his face once more. She felt sure he would, but he didn't. Then, just as she was about to turn away and start down the hill toward town, he did turn, and his hand lifted, fluttering for a moment in the dark like a moth. Susan lifted her own in return and then went her way, feeling happy and unhappy at the same time. Yet, and this was perhaps the most important thing, she no longer felt soiled. When she had touched the boy's lips, Rhea's touch seemed to have left her skin. A small magic, perhaps, but she welcomed it. She walked on, smiling a little and looking up at the stars more frequently than was her habit when out at dark. Let me see how long this next chapter is. It's not too long, and my renovation person isn't here yet, so I'm only worried that if I start it, they'll show up in the middle of it. So I'll let you guys tell me, do we stop here, or do we keep reading? Or does nobody have an opinion? Because that's fine too. I think it's only about 20 pages. Okay. Long after moonset. He rode restlessly for nearly 2 hours back and forth along what she called the drop, never pushing Rusher above a trot. Although he although what he wanted to do was gallop the big gelding under the stars until his blood began to cool a little. It'll cool plenty if you draw attention to yourself, he thought, and likely you won't even have to cool it yourself. Fools are the only folk on earth who can't absolutely count on getting what they deserve. The old saying made him think of the scared and bow-legged man who had been his life's greatest teacher, and he smiled. Scarred and bow-legged man, sorry. At last he turned his horse down the slope to the trickle of brook which ran there, and followed it with a smile half upstream, past several gathers of horses. They looked at Rusher with a kind of sleepy, well-eyed surprise, to a grove of willows. From the hollow within, a horse whickered softly. Rusher whickered in return, stamping one hoof and nodding his head up and down. His rider ducked his own head as he passed through the willow fronds, and suddenly there was a narrow and inhuman white face hanging before him, its upper half all but swallowed by black, pupilless eyes. He dipped for his guns. The third time tonight he'd done that, and for the third time there was nothing there. Not that it mattered. Already he recognized what was hanging before him on a string. That idiotic rook's skull. The young man, who was currently calling himself Arthur Heath, had taken it off his saddle. It amused him to call the skulls, so perched their lookout, ugly as an old gamer but perfect cheap to feed, and hung it here as a prank greeting. Him and his jokes. Rusher's master batted it aside hard enough to break the string and send the skull flying into the dark. "Fie, Roland," said a voice from the shadows. It was reproachful, but there was laughter bubbling just beneath, as there always was. Cuthbert was his oldest friend. The marks of their first teeth had been embedded on many of the same toys, but Roland had in some ways never understood him. Nor was it just his laughter on the long-ago day when Hax, the palace cook, was to be hung for a traitor on the gallows hill. Cuthbert had been in an agony of terror and remorse. He told Roland he couldn't stay, couldn't watch, but in the end he had done both. Because neither the stupid jokes nor the easy surface emotions were the truth of Cuthbert Allgood. As Roland entered the hollow of the center of the grove, a dark shape stepped out from behind the tree where it had been keeping. Halfway across the clearing, it resolved itself into a tall, narrow-hipped boy who was barefooted below his jeans and bare-chested above them. In one hand he held an enormous antique revolver, a kind which was sometimes called a beer barrel because of the cylinder size. "Fie," Cuthbert repeated, as he liked the sound of the word, not archaic only in forgotten backwaters like Mayhees. "That's a fine way to treat the guard o' the watch, smacking the poor thin-faced fella halfway to the nearest mountain range." "If I'd been wearing a gun, I likely would have blown it to smithereens and woke half the countryside." "I knew you wouldn't be going about strapped," Cuthbert answered mildly. "You're remarkably ill-looking, Roland, son of Stephen, but nobody's fool, even as you approach the ancient age of 15. I thought we'd agreed we'd use the names we're traveling under, even amongst ourselves." Cuthbert stuck out his leg, bare heel planted in the turf, and bowed with his arms outstretched and his hands strenuously bent at the wrist. An inspired imitation of the sort of man for whom court had become a career. He also looked remarkably like a heron standing in a marsh, and when Roland snorted laughter in spite of himself, then he touched the inside of his left wrist to his forehead to see if he had a fever. He felt feverish enough inside his head, gods knew, but the skin above his eyes felt cool. "I cry your pardon, gunslinger," Cuthbert said, his eyes and hands still turned humbly down. The smile on Roland's face died. "And don't call me that again, Cuthbert. Please. Not here, not anywhere. Not if you value me." Cuthbert dropped his pose at once and came quickly to where Roland sat upon his horse. He looked honestly humbled. "Roland. Will. I'm sorry." Roland clapped him on the shoulder. "No harm done. Just remember from here on out, Mayhees may be at the end of the world, but it still is the world. Where's Elaine? Dick, you mean? Where do you think?" Cuthbert pointed across the clearing to where a dark hulk was either snoring or slowly choking to death. "That one," Cuthbert said, "would sleep through an earthquake." But you heard me coming and woke. Yes, Cuthbert said. His eyes were on Roland's face, searching it with an intensity that made Roland feel a little uneasy. Did something happen to you? You look different. Do I? Yes. Excited. Aired out somehow. If he was going to tell Cuthbert about Susan, now was the time. He decided without really thinking about it. Most of his decisions, certainly the best of them, were made in the same way. Not to tell. If he met her at the mayor's house, it would be the first time, as far as Cuthbert and Elaine knew as well. What harm in that? I've been properly aired, all right, he said, dismounting and bending to uncinch the girths of his saddle. I've seen some interesting things, too. Ah? Speak, companion of my bosom's dearest tenant. I'll wait until tomorrow, I think, when yon hibernating bear is finally awake. Then I only have to tell once. Besides, I'm tired. I'll share you one thing, though. There are too many horses in these parts, even for a barony renowned for its horse flesh. Too many, by far. Before Cuthbert could ask any questions, Roland pulled the saddle from Rusher's back and set it down beside 3 small wicker cages, which had been bound together with rawhide, making them into a carrier which could be secured to a horse's back. Inside, 3 pigeons with white rings around their necks cooed sleepily. One took his head out from beneath his wings and had peeked at Roland and then tucked himself away again. These fellows all right? Roland asked. Fine. Pecking and shitting happily in their straw. As far as they're concerned, they're on vacation. What did you mean about... Tomorrow, Roland said, and Cuthbert, seeing there would be no more, only nodded and went to find his lean and bony lookout. 20 minutes later, Rusher unloaded and rubbed down and set to forage with Buckskin and Glue Boy. Cuthbert could not even name his horse as a normal person would. Roland lay on his back in his bedroll, looking up at the late stars overhead. Cuthbert had gone back to sleep as easily as he had awakened at the sound of Rusher's hooves, but Roland had never felt less sleepy in his life. His mind turned back a month to the whore's room, to his father sitting on the whore's bed and watching him dress. The words his father had spoken, I have known for 2 years, had reverberated like a struck gong in Roland's head. He suspected they might continue to do so for the rest of his life. But his father had much more to say, about Martin, about Roland's mother, who was, perhaps, more sinned against than sinning, about harriers who called themselves patriots, and about John Farson, who had indeed been in Crescia, and who was gone from that place now, vanished, as he had a way of doing, like smoke in a high wind. Before leaving, he and his men had burned Indre, the barony seat, pretty much to the ground. The slaughter had been in the hundreds, and perhaps it was no surprise that Crescia had since repudiated the affiliation and spoken for the good man. The barony governor, the mayor of Indre, and the high sheriff had all ended the early summer day which concluded Farson's visit with their heads on a wall guarding the town's entrance. That was, Stephen Deshane had said, pretty persuasive politics. It was a game of castles where both armies had come out from behind their hillocks and the final moves had commenced, Roland's father had said, and, as was so often the case with popular revolutions, that game was apt to be over before many in the baronies of the Midworlds had begun to realize that John Farson was a serious threat, or if you were one of those who believed passionately in his vision of democracy and an end to what he called class slavery and ancient fairy tales, a serious agent of change. His father and his father's small quartet of gunslingers, Roland was amused to learn, cared little about Farson in either light. They looked upon him as small cheese, looked upon the filiation itself as small cheese, come to that. I'm going to send you away, Stephen had said, sitting there on the bed and looking somberly at his only son, the one who had lived. There is no true safe place left in Midworld, but the barony of Mejis on the clean sea is as close to true safety as any place may be these days, so it's there you'll go, along with at least 2 of your mates. Elaine, I suppose, for one. Just not the laughing boy for the other, I beg you. You'd be better off with a barking dog. Roland, who on any other day in his life would have been overjoyed at the prospect of seeing some of the wider world, had protested hotly. If the final battles against the good man were at hand, he wanted to fight them at his father's side. He was a gunslinger now, after all, if only apprentice, and His father had shaken his head slowly and emphatically. "No, Roland, you don't understand. You shall, however, as well as possible. You shall." Later the two of them had walked the high battlements above Midworld's last living city, green and gorgeous, gleed in the morning sun, with its pennants flapping and the vendors in the street of the old quarter and horses trotting on the bridle paths which radiated out from the palace, standing at the heart of everything. His father had told him more, not everything, and he had understood more, far from everything, nor did his father understand everything. The Dark Tower had not been mentioned by either of them, but already it hung in Roland's mind, a possibility like a storm cloud far away on the horizon. Was the tower what all of this was really about? Not a jumped-up harrier with dreams of ruling Midworld, not the wizard who had enchanted his mother, not the glass ball which Stephen and his posse had hoped to find in Cressia, but the Dark Tower? He hadn't asked. He hadn't dared ask. Now he shifted his bedroll and closed his eyes. He saw the girl's face at once. He felt her lips pressed firmly against his own again, and the smell of scent of her skin. He was instantly hot from the top of his head to the base of his spine, cold from the base of his spine to the tips of his toes, and then he thought of the way her legs had flashed as she slid from Rusher's back. Also the glimmer of the undergarments beneath her briefly raised dress, and his hot half and cold half changed places. The whore had taken his virginity but wouldn't kiss him. He turned her face aside when he tried to kiss her. She'd allowed him to do whatever else he wanted, but not that. At the time he'd been bitterly disappointed. Now he was glad. The eye of his adolescent mind, both restless and clear, considered the braid which fell down her back to her waist, the soft dimples which had formed the corners of her mouth when she smiled, the lilt of her voice, her old-fashioned way of saying I and nay, ye and yer and da. He thought of how her hands had felt on his shoulders as she stretched up to kiss him, and that he would give everything he owned to feel her hands there again, so light and so firm, and her mouth on his. It was a mouth that knew only a little about kissing, he guessed, but that was a little more than he knew himself. "Be careful, Roland. Don't let your feeling for this girl tip anything over. She's not free anyway. She said as much. Not married, but spoken for in some other way." Roland was far from the restless creature he would eventually become, but the seeds of that restlessness were there. Small, stony things that would, in their time, grow into trees with deep roots and bitter fruits. Now one of these seeds cracked open and sent up its first sharp blade. What's been spoken for may be unspoken, and what's done may be undone. Nothing's sure, but I want her. Yes, that was the one thing he did know, and he knew it as well as he knew the face of his father. He wanted her. Not as he had wanted the whore when she lay naked on her bed with her legs spread and her half-lidded eyes looking up at him, but in the way he wanted food when he was hungry, or water when he was thirsty, in the way he supposed that he wanted to drag Martin's dusty body behind his horse down Gilead's high road in the payment for what the wizard had done to his mother. He wanted her. He wanted the girl Susan. Roland turned over on his other side, closed his eyes, and fell asleep. His rest was thin and lit by crudely poetic dreams only adolescent boys have. Dreams where sexual attraction and romantic love come together and resonate more powerfully than they ever will again. In these thirsty visions, Susan Delgado put her hands on Roland's shoulders over and over, kissed his mouth over and over, and told him over and over to come to her for the first time, to be with her for the first time, to see her for the first time, and to see her very well. 5 miles or so from where Roland slept and dreamed his dreams, Susan Delgado lay in her bed and looked out her window and watched Old Star begin to grow pale with the approaching dawn. Sleep was no closer now than it had been when she lay down, and there was a throb between her legs where the old woman had touched her. It was distracting, but no longer unpleasant, because she now associated it with the boy she'd met on the road and impulsively kissed by starlight. Every time she shifted her legs, that throb flared into a brief sweet ache. When she'd got home, Aunt Cord, who would have been in her own bed an hour before on any ordinary night, had been sitting in her rocking chair by the fireplace, dead and cold and swept clean of ashes at this time of year. With a lap full of lace, she looked like a wave of froth against her dowdy black dress. She was edging it, with a speed that seemed almost supernatural to Susan, and she hadn't looked up when the door opened and her niece came in on a swirl of breeze. "I expected ye an hour ago," Aunt Cord said. And then, although she didn't sound it, "I was worried." "I?" Susan asked, and said no more. She thought that on any other night she would have offered one of her fumbling excuses, which always sounded like a lie to her own ears. It was the effect Aunt Cord had on her all her life, but this hadn't been an ordinary night. Never in her life had there been a night like this. She found she could not get Will Dearborn out of her mind. Aunt Cord had looked up then, her close-set, rather beady eyes sharp and inquisitive above her narrow blade of a nose. Some things hadn't changed since Susan had set out for the Coos. She had still been able to feel her aunt's eyes brushing across her face and down her body, the little whisk brooms with sharp bristles. "What took ye so long?" Aunt Cord had asked. "Was there trouble?" "No trouble," Susan had replied. But for a moment she thought of how the witch had stood beside her in the doorway, pulling her braid through that gnarled tube of one loosely clenched fist. She remembered wanting to go, and she remembered asking Rhea if their business was done. "Mayhap there's one more little thing," the old woman had said, or so Susan thought. But what had that one more little thing been? She couldn't remember, and really, what did it matter? She was shut of Rhea until her belly began to rise with Thorin's child, and if there could be no baby-making until Reap Night, she'd not be returning to the coast until late winter at the soonest. An age, and it would be longer than that, were she slow to kindle. "I walked slowly home, Aunt, that's all." "Then why look ye so?" Aunt Cord had asked, scant brows knitting together the vertical line which creased her brow. "How so?" Susan had asked, taking off her apron and knotting the strings and hanging it on the hook just inside the kitchen door. "Fleshy, frothy, like milk fresh out of the cow." She almost laughed. Aunt Cord, who knew as little about men as Susan did about the stars and planets, had struck it directly. Fleshy and frothy was exactly how she felt. "Only the night air, I suppose," she said. "I saw a meteor, Aunt, and heard the thinny. The sound's strong tonight." "Aye?" her aunt asked without interest, then returned to the subject which did interest her. "Did it hurt?" "A little." "Did you cry?" Susan shook her head. "Good. Better not. Always better. She likes it when they cry, I heard. Now, Sue, did she give you something? Did the old pussy give you anything?" "Aye." She reached in her pocket and brought out the paper with "Honest" written upon it. She held it out, but her aunt snatched it away with a greedy look. Cordelia had been quite the sugar plum over the last month or so, but now that she had what she wanted, and now that Susan had come too far and promised too much to have a change of heart, she'd reverted to the sour, supercilious, often suspicious woman Susan had grown up with, the one who'd been driven into almost weekly bouts of rage by her phlegmatic, life-goes-as-it-twill brother. In a way, it was a relief. It had been nerve-wracking to have Aunt Cord playing Sibylla Good Sprite day after day. Aye, there's her mark all right," her aunt said, tracing her fingers over the bottom of the sheet. "The devil's hoof is what it means, some say. But what do we care, eh, Sue? Nasty, horrid creature that she is, she still made it possible for two women to get out in the world a little longer. And you'll have to see her once more, probably, around year's end, when you've caught proper." "It will be later than that," Susan had told her. "I'm not to lie with him until the full demon moon, after the reaping fair and the bonfire." Aunt Cord had started, eyes wide, mouth open. Said she so? "Are you calling me a liar, Auntie?" she had thought with a sharpness that wasn't much like her. Usually, her nature was more like her father's. "Aye." "But why? Why so long?" Aunt Cord was obviously upset, obviously disappointed. There had so far been 8 pieces of silver and 4 of gold out of this. They were tucked up wherever it was Aunt Cord squirreled her money away, and Susan suspected there was a fair amount of it, although Cordelia liked to plead poverty at every opportunity. And twice that much was still owed, or would be, once the blood-stained sheet went to the mayor's house laundress. That same amount would be paid yet again when Rhea had confirmed the baby and the baby's honesty. A lot of money, all that. A great lot for a little place like this and little folk like them, and now to have the paying of it put back so far. Then came a sin Susan had prayed over, although without much enthusiasm, before getting into her bed. She had rather enjoyed the cheated, frustrated look on Aunt Cord's face, the look of the thwarted miser. "Why so long?" she repeated. "I suppose you could go up the coos and ask her." Cordelia Delgado's lips, thin to begin with, had pressed together so tightly they almost disappeared. "Are you pert, missy? Are you pert with me?" "No, I'm much too tired to be pert with anyone. I want to go wash. I can still feel her hands on me, so I can. And go to bed." "Then do so. Perhaps in the morning we can discuss this in a more ladylike fashion. And we must go and see Hart, of course." She folded the paper Rhea had given Susan, looking pleased at the prospect of visiting Hart Thorin, and moved her hand toward her dress pocket. "No," Susan said. Her voice had been unusually sharp, enough so to freeze her aunt's hand mid-air. Cordelia had looked at her frankly startled. Susan had felt a little embarrassed by that look, but she hadn't dropped her eyes, and when she held her own hand, it had been steady enough. "I'm to have the keeping of that, Aunt." "Who tells you to speak so?" Aunt Cord had asked, her voice almost whining with outrage. It was close to blasphemy, Susan supposed, but for a moment Aunt Cord's voice had reminded her of the sound the thinny made. "Who tells ye to speak so to the woman who raised a motherless girl, to the sister of that girl's poor dead father?" "You know who," Susan said. She still held her hand out. "I'm to keep it, and I'm to give it to Mayor Thorin. She said she didn't care what happened to it then. He could wipe his bum with it for all of her." The flush which suffused her aunt's face at that had been very enjoyable, but until then, it was to be in my keeping. "I never heard of such a thing," Aunt Cordelia had huffed, but she handed the grimy scrap of paper back, giving the girl keep of such an important document to a mere scrap of a girl. Yet not too mere a scrap of a girl am I, to lie under him and listen to his bones creak and take his seed, and mayhap bear his child. She dropped her eyes to her pocket as she put the paper away again, not wanting Aunt Cord to see the resentment in them. "Go up," Aunt Cord had said, brushing the froth of lace off her lap and into her work basket, where it lay in an unaccustomed tangle. "And when you do wash, do your mouth with especial care. Cleanse it of its impudence and disrespect toward those who have given up much for love of its owner." Susan had gone silently, biting back 1,000 retorts, mounting the stairs as she had so often, throbbing with a mixture of shame and resentment. And now here she was, in her bed and still awake as the stars paled away and the first brighter shades began to color the sky. The events of the night just past slipped through her mind in a kind of fantastical blur, like shuffled playing cards, and the one which turned up the most persistent was the face of Will Dearborn. She thought of how that face could be hard at one moment and softened so unexpectedly at the next. And it was a handsome face. Aye, she thought so. For herself, she knew so. I've never asked a girl to ride out with me, or if she would accept a visit of me. I would ask you, Susan, daughter of Patrick. Why now? Why should I meet him now when no good can come of it? If it's Ka, it'll come like a wind, like a cyclone. She tossed from one side of the bed to the other, then at last rolled onto her back again. There would be no sleep for her in what remained of this night, she thought. She might as well walk out onto the drop and watch the sun come up. Yet she continued to lie in the bed, feeling somehow sick and well at the same time, looking into the shadows and listening to the first cries of the morning birds, thinking of how his mouth had felt against hers, the tender grain of it, and the feeling of his teeth below his lips, the smell of his skin, the rough texture of his shirt under her palms. She now put those palms against the top of her shift and cupped her breast with her fingers. The nipples were hard, like little pebbles, and when she touched them, the heat between her legs flared suddenly and urgently. She could sleep, she thought. She could if she took care of that heat, if she knew how, and she did. The old woman had shown her. Even a girl who's intact don't need a lack of a shiver now and then, like a little bud of silk, so it is. Susan shifted in the bed and slipped a hand beneath the sheet. She forced the old woman's bright eyes and out of her mind. It wasn't hard to do that at all, once you set your mind to it, she discovered, and replaced it with the face of the boy with the big gelding and the silly flat-crowned hat. For a moment the vision of her mind became so clear and so sweet that it was real, and all the rest of her life only a drab dream. In the vision he kissed her over and over, their mouths widening, their tongues touching. What he breathed out, she breathed in. She burned in her bed like a torch, and when the sun finally came over the horizon some short time later, she lay deeply asleep with a faint smile on her lips and her unbraided hair lying across the side of her face and her pillow like loose gold. In the last hour before dawn, the public room of the Traveller's Rest was as quiet as it ever became. The gaslight, which turned the chandelier into a brilliant jewel until two of the morning, or so most nights, were now turned down to guttering blue points, and long, high room was shadowy and spectral. In one corner lay a jumble of kindling, the remains of a couple of chairs smashed in a fight over a watch-me game. The combatants were currently residing in the High Sheriff's drunk cell. In another corner was a fairly large puddle of congealing puke. On the raised platform at the east end of the room stood a battered piano. Propped against its bench was the Ironwood Club, which belonged to Barky, the saloon's bouncer and all-around tough man. Barky himself, the naked mound of his scarred stomach rising above the waistband of his corduroy pants like a clod of bread dough, lay under the bench, snoring. In one hand he held a playing card, the deuce of diamonds. At the west end of the room were the card tables. Two drunks lay with their heads on one of these, snoring and drooling on the green felt, their outstretched hands touching. Above them on the wall was a picture of Arthur, the great king of Eld, astride his white stallion, and a sign which read, in a curious mixture of high and low speech, "Argue not about the hand you were dealt in the cards of life." Mounted behind the bar, which ran the length of the room, was a monstrous trophy, a two-headed elk with a rack of antlers like a forest grove and 4 glaring eyes. The beast was known to the local habituates of the Travelers as the Romp. None could have said why. Some wit had carefully drawn a pair of sow-titty condoms over the prongs of the 2 of its antlers. Laying on the bar itself and directly beneath the Romp's disapproving gaze was Petty the Trotter, one of the Travelers' dancers and gilly girls. Although Petty's actual girlhood was well behind her now, and soon she would be reduced to doing her business on her knees behind the Travelers rather than upstairs in one of the tiny cribs. Her plump legs were spread, one dangling over the bar on the inside and one on the outside, the filthy tangle of her skirt frothed up between. She breathed in long snores, occasionally twitching at the feet and fat fingers. The only other sounds were the hot summer wind outside and the soft, regular snap of cards being turned one by one. A small table stood by itself near the bat-wing doors which gave upon the Hanbury High Street. It was here that Coral Thorin, owner of the Traveller's Rest and the mayor's sister, sat on the nights when she descended from her suite to be a part of the company. When she came down early, when there were still more steaks than whiskey being served across the old scratched bar, and went back up around the time that Sheb, the piano player, sat down and began to pound his hideous instrument. The mayor himself never came in at all, although it was well known that he owned at least a half interest in the Travelers. Clan Thorin enjoyed the money the place brought in. They just didn't enjoy the look of it after midnight, when the sawdust spread on the floor began to soak up the spilled beer and the spilled blood. Yet there was a hard streak in Coral, who had 20 years before been what was called a wild child. She was younger than her political brother, not so thin and good-looking in a large-eyed, weasel-headed way. No one sat at her table during the saloon's operating hours. Barky would have put a stop to anyone who tried, and double quick, But operating hours were over now, the drunks mostly gone or passed out upstairs. Sheb curled up and fast asleep in the corner behind the piano. The soft-headed boy who cleaned the place had been gone since 2 o'clock or so, chased out by the jeers and insults and a few flying beer glasses, as he always was. Roy DePape, in particular, had no love in his heart for that particular lad. He would be back around 9 or so to begin readying the old party palace for another night of hilarity, but until then, the man sitting at Mistress Thorne's table had the place to himself. A game of patience was laid out before him, black on red, red on black, the partially formed square court above all, just as it was in the affairs of men. In his left hand the player held the remains of the deck. As he flipped the cards up one by one, the tattoo on his right hand moved. It was disconcerting somehow, as if the coffin were breathing. The card player was an oldish fella, not as thin as the mayor or his sister, but thin. His long white hair straggled down his back. He was deeply tanned except for his neck, where he always burned. The flesh there hung in scant wattles. He wore a mustache so long the ragged white ends hung nearly to his jaw. A sham gunslinger's mustache, many thought it, but no one used the word sham to Eldred Jonas's face. He wore a white silk shirt, and a black-handled revolver hung low on his hip. His large red-brimmed eyes looked sad at first glance. A second closer look showed them only to be watery. Of emotion, they were as dead as the eyes of the rump. He turned up the ace of wands. No place for it. "Pah, you bugger," he said in an old reedy voice. It quavered as well, like the voice of a man on the verge of tears. It fit perfectly with his damp and red-rimmed eyes. He swept the cards together. Before he could reshuffle, a door opened and closed softly upstairs. Jonas put the cards aside and dropped his hand to the butt of his gun. Then, as he recognized the sound of Reynolds' boots coming along the gallery, he let go of the gun and drew his tobacco pouch from his belt instead. The hem of the cloak Reynolds always wore came into view, and then he was coming down the stairs, his face freshly washed and his curly red hair hanging about his ears. Vain of his looks was dear old Mr. Reynolds, and why'd not? It sent his cock on its exploring way up more damp and cozy cracks than Jonas had ever seen in his life, and Jonas was twice his age. At the bottom of the stairs, Reynolds walked along the bar, pausing to squeeze one of Petty's plump thighs, and then crossed to where Jonas sat with his makings and his deck of cards. "Evening, Eldred." "Morning, Clay." Jonas opened the sack, took out a paper, and sprinkled tobacco into it. His voice shook, but his hands were steady. "Like a smoke?" "I could do with one." Reynolds pulled out a chair, turned it around, and sat with his forearms crossed on its back. When Jonas handed him the cigarette, Reynolds danced it along the back of his fingers, an old gunslinger trick. The big coffin hunters were full of old gunslinger tricks. "Where's Roy? With her nibs?" They had been in Hambry a little over a month now, and in that time DePape had conceived a passion for a 15-year-old whore named Deborah. Her bow-legged, clumping walk and her way of squinting off into the distance led Jonas to suspect she was another cowgirl from a long line of them, but she had a high-hat ways. It was Clay who had started calling the girl her nibs, or her majesty, or sometimes when drunk, Roy's coronation cunt. Reynolds now nodded. "It's like he's drunk on her." "He'll be all right. He ain't throwing us over for some little snuggle bunny with pimples on her tits. Why, she's so ignorant she can't spell cat. Not so much as cat, no. I asked her." Jonas made a second cigarette, drew a sulfur match from the sack, and popped it alight with his thumbnail. He lit Reynolds first, and then his own. A small yellow cur came in under the bat-wing doors. The men watched it in silence, smoking. It crossed the room, first, stiffened at the curdle vomit in the corner, then began to eat it. Its stub of a tail wagged back and forth as it dined. Reynolds nodded toward the admonishment not to argue about the cards you were dealt. "That mutt'd understand that, I'd say." Not at all," Jonas demurred. "Just a dog is all he is, a spew-eating dog. I heard a horse 20 minutes ago, first on the come, then on the go. Would it have been one of the hired watchmen? You don't miss a trick, do you?" "Don't pay to, no. Don't pay a bit. Was it?" Yep, fellow who works for one of the small freeholders out along the east end of the drop. He's seen 'em come in. 3 young babies. Reynold pronounced this last as they did in the north, baronies, babbies. Nothing to worry of. Now, we don't know that, Jonas said, his quavering voice making him sound like a temporizing old man. Young eyes see far, they say. Young eyes see what they're pointed at, Reynolds replied. The dog trotted past him, licking its chops. Reynolds helped it on its way with a kick the cur was not quite quick enough to avoid. It scuttled back, out under the bat wings, uttering little yike, yike sounds that made Barky snort thickly from his place of rest beneath the piano bench. His hand opened and the playing card dropped out of it. Maybe so, maybe not, Jonas said. In any case, they're affiliation brats. Son of big estates off in Green somewhere, if Reimer, that fool he works for, have it straight. That means we'll be very, very careful. Walk easy, like on eggshells. Why, we've got three more months here, at least, and those young'uns may be here that whole time, counting this and counting that and putting it all down on paper. Folks counting things ain't good for us right now, not for men in the resupply business. Come on. It's make work, that's all. A slap on the wrist for getting in trouble. Their daddy's no Farsons in charge of the whole southwest edge now and sitting on high ground. The brats may know the same. That playtime's pert near over for the affiliation, and it's all pukesome royalty. Can't know, Clay. With folks like these, you can't know which way they'll jump. At the very least, they may try to do a half-decent job, just to try and get on the good side of their parents again. We'll know better when we see 'em, but I tell you one thing. We can't just put guns to the back of their heads and drop them like broke-leg horses if we see the wrong thing. Their daddies might be mad at 'em alive, but I think they'd be very tender of 'em dead. That's just the way daddies are. We'll want to be trig, Clay. As trig as we can be. Better leave to Pape out of it, then. Roy'll be fine, Jonas said in his quavery voice. He dropped the stub of his cigarette to the floor and crushed it under his boot heel. He looked up at the romp's glassy eyes and squinted as if calculating. Tonight, your friend said. They'll arrive tonight, these brats. Yep. They'll be in to see Avery tomorrow, then, I reckon. This was Herc Avery, High Sheriff of Machees and Chief Constable of Hambury, a large man who was as loose as a trundle of laundry. Reckon so, Clay Reynolds said, to present their papers and all. Yes, sir. Yes, indeedy. How'd you do, and how do you do, and how do you do again? Reynolds said nothing. He often didn't understand Jonas, but he had been riding with him since the age of 15 and knew it was usually better not to ask for enlightenment. If you did, you were apt to end up listening to a Manny lecture about the other worlds the old buzzards had visited through what he called the special doors. As far as Reynolds was concerned, there were enough ordinary doors in the world to keep him busy. I'll speak to Reimer, and Reimer I'll ask the sheriff about what they should say. Where they should stay, Jonas said. I think the bunkhouse at the old Bar K Ranch. You know where I mean. Reynolds did. In a barony like Machees, you got to know the few landmarks in a hurry. The Bar K was a deserted spread of land northwest of town, not too far from the weird, squalling canyon. They burned at the mouth of the canyon every fall, and once, 6 or 7 years ago, the wind had shifted and gone back wrong and burnt most of the Bar K to the ground, barns, stables, the home place. It had spared the bunkhouse, however, and that would be a good spot for the 3 tenderfeet from the Inners. It was away from the drop. It was also away from the oil patch. You like it, don't ye? Jonas asked, putting on a hick Hambry accent. Aye, you like it very much. I can see you do, my cully. You know what they say in Crescia. If you'd steal the silver from the dining room, first put the dog in the pantry. Reynolds nodded. It was good advice. And those trucks? Those what-do-you-call-ems? Tankers? Fine where they are, Jonas said. Not that we could move 'em now without attracting the wrong kind of attention, eh? You and Roy want to go out there and cover them with brush. Lay it on nice and thick. Day after tomorrow you'll do it. And where will you be while we're flexing our muscles out at Sitgo? By daylight? Preparing for dinner at the mayor's house, you clod. The dinner Thorne will be given to introduce his guests from the great world to the shit-picky society of the smaller one. Jonas began making another cigarette. He gazed up at the romp rather than at what he was doing and still spilled barely a scrap of tobacco. A bath, a shave, a trim of those tangled old man's locks. I might even wax my mustache, Clay. What do you say to that? Don't strain yourself, Eldred. Jonas laughed, and the sound shrill enough to make Barky mutter and Petty stir uneasily on her makeshift bar-top bed. So Roy and I aren't invited to this fancy do? You'll be invited. Oh, yes, you'll be invited very warmly, Jonas said, and handed Reynolds the fresh cigarette. He began making another for himself. 1 second, I'm so sorry. Sorry about that. That was my favorite person in the whole world, so they get first dibs. Sorry. So sorry about that, guys. But we're almost to the end of this chapter, so. And the next chapter is called Welcome to Town. Where were we? Jonas laughed, and the sound shrill enough to make Barky mutter and Petty stir uneasily on her makeshift bar-top bed. So Roy and I aren't invited to this fancy do? You'll be invited. Oh, yes, you'll be invited very warmly, Jonas said, and handed Reynolds the fresh cigarette. He began making another for himself. I'll offer your excuses. I'll do you boys proud. Count on me. Strong men may weep. Also, we can spend the day out there in the dust and stink, covering those hulks. You're too kind, Jonas. I'll be asking questions as well, Jonas said dreamily, drifting here and there, looking spruce, smelling of the bayberries, and asking my little questions. I've known folks in our little line of trade who go to a fat, jolly fellow to find out the gossip, a saloon keeper or a bartender, perhaps a livery stable owner, or one of the chubby fellows who always hangs about the jail or the courthouse with his thumbs tucked into his vest pockets. As for myself, Clay, I find that a woman's best, and the narrower the better. One with more nose than tits sticking off of her. I look for one who don't paint her lips and keeps her hair scooped back against her head. You have someone in mind? Yes, Cordelia Delgado's her name. Delgado. You know the name. It's on the lips of everyone in this town, I reckon. Susan Delgado, our esteemed mayor's soon-to-be Gilly. Cordelia's her aunt. Now here's a fact of human nature I found. Folks are more apt to talk to someone like her, who plays them close, than they are to the local jolly types who'll buy you a drink. And that lady plays them close. I'm going to slip in next to her at the dinner, and I'm going to compliment her on the perfume I doubt like hell she'll be wearing, and I'm going to keep her wine glass full. Now how sounds that for a plan? A plan for what? That's what I want to know. For the games of castle we may have to play, Jonas said, and all the lightness dropped out of his voice. We're to believe that these boys have been sent here more as punishment than to do a real job of work. It sounds plausible, too. I've known rakes in my mind, and it sounds plausible indeed. I believe it each day until 3 in the morning, and then a little doubt sets in. And do you know what, Clay? Reynold shook his head. I'm right to doubt. Just as I was right to go with Reimer to Old Man Thorin and convince him that Farson's glass would be better kept with the witch woman for the nonce. She'll keep it in a place where a gunslinger couldn't find it, let alone a nosy lad who's yet to have his first piece of ours. These old strange times, a storm's coming, and when you know the wind's going to blow, it's best to keep your gear battened down. He looked at the cigarette he had made. He had been dancing it along the backs of his knuckles, as Reynolds had done earlier. Jonas pushed back to the fall of his hair and tucked the cigarette behind his ear. I don't want to smoke, he said, standing up and stretching. His back made small crackling sounds. I'm crazy to smoke at this hour of the morning. Too many cigarettes are apt to keep an old man like me awake. He walked toward the stairs, squeezing Petty's bare leg as he went by, also as Reynolds had done. At the foot of the stairs, he looked back. I don't want to kill them. Things are delicate enough without that. I'll smell quite a little wrong on them, and not lift a finger. No, not a single finger of my hand, but I'd like to make things clear on their place in the great scheme of things. Give them a sore paw. Jonas brightened. Yes, sir, partner. Maybe a sore paw is just what I'd like to give them. Make them think twice about tangling with the big coffin hunters later on, when it matters. Make them swing wide around us when they see us in the road. Yes, sir, that's something to think about. It really is. He started up the stairs, chuckling a little, his limp quite pronounced. It got worse late at night. It was a limp Roland's old teacher, Court, might have recognized, for Court had seen the blow which caused it. Court's own father had dealt it with an ironwood club, breaking Eldred Jonas's leg in the yard behind the great hall of Glede before taking the boy's weapons and sending him west, gunless, into exile. Eventually, the man the boy had become had found a gun, of course. The exiles always did, if they looked hard enough. That such guns could never be quite the same as the big ones with their sandalwood grips might haunt them for the rest of their lives, but those who needed guns could still find them, even in this world. Reynolds watched until he was gone, then took his seat at Coral Thorin's desk, shuffled cards, and continued the game which Jonas had left half finished. Outside, the sun was coming up. And we will stop there for today because, number one, the next chapter is a bit longer, and number two, I should go start renovations, and my helper should be here soon. But yeah, thank you for coming, and next time we will start on the second part of chapter 5 of the second book in book 4. And it will be called Welcome to Town. So thank you everyone for coming and listening and all that good stuff, and don't forget to smile and have fun and laugh. Later days, pretty shiny peoples.